All right, we good?
Yeah.
Sweet. So, I think we were talking about Soundgarden. So, it's Badmotorfinger, and we're out supporting Guns N' Roses. Again, there was some choices made because we were offered the tour with Nirvana and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and decided not to do that. And then Pearl Jam went and did that tour, and that's one of those tours in, like, you know, grunge lore or whatever, that's one of the, oh my God, that was one of the best tours ever at the time or whatever. But yeah, we didn't do it. And the thought is like, okay, we've played to a lot of that audience. Let's go try to play to an audience that we haven't played to, i.e. like the Guns audience, right? So, and I still think that was the route to go. I mean, people can disagree with me. That's your right to. But in my opinion, I thought it was a good decision. So we go out, we support Guns N' Roses. As you may or may not know, the singer, Axl, at that time, and maybe he still does, I don't know, he didn't always like show up on time. They kind of always tended to go on late. So as a support act, I think we were contracted to play like 45 minutes, right? And even sometimes that's long for a support band. I mean, I've been with support bands where it's like 30 minutes, get your shit out, see you, right? So 45 minutes. I think, and of all the shows that we supported Guns on, and that period from in 91 through January of 92 that I was part of, I don't know there was any show where we played 45 minutes. Usually it was an hour minimum, because we'd be done, and Opie, the production manager, come up to me, I need 15 minutes more. I'm doing my Opie impersonation. People that know him will chuckle a little bit, but he's got kind of a deep voice, right? I'm like, okay. So he'd come off stage, and I'd be like, okay, we got to do another 15, right? You know, and Chris would be looking at me like, man, I just sang 45. Like, now I got to do another 15. And then some nights, like, we do the other 15, and it'd be like, I need 15 minutes more. So your support act's playing an hour and a half, right? They're doing a 45, a 15, and a 15, you know? And on those nights, it was like, kind of like, well, what are we going to play? You know what I mean? We've kind of played all the songs and then some that we wanted to play, right? And, you know, now we've got to play another 15, right? So, I mean, hats off to the Soundgarden guys. They always rolled with it. I don't really remember them grumbling much. I mean, I know that, you know, Chris, some nights, you know, as singers do, you know, it was like, oh, this is going to suck a little bit, but, you know. But again, we were, besides doing, if I remember right, besides doing the GNR gigs, we were doing gigs on our own, right? Because they weren't playing a lot, you know, and these are the days when you didn't get paid a lot to be a support act, right? I mean, you know, I don't want to talk out of turn, but I think we were getting paid $1,200 a night to support GNR, you know, and you know, that was back still in the days of tour support, right? Like record companies would give you tour support to go do a tour with, right? And then that would get you out and get you publicity and would sell records, and that's where they made their money. Of course, that model's out the window because that doesn't work anymore. But in those days, that's what it was. So then we go do shows on our own. I can remember we did a show, God, well, it was somewhere near, it was somewhere down south. I want to say it was between Florida. It might have been Pensacola or whatever. But like Chris was breaking guitars left and right, and I was out of guitars, right? I mean, like Gibson had given us, I think, 3 Les Paul Customs, because in that tour, we at least had some support. So he's going through them, and we play this club, and he takes the headstock off the guitar. And I'd been like, mate, I get it, it's your thing, whatever. And it's the one time where I intentionally damaged an instrument. So I went out to get it, and we had these like cages that the amps were in, and Chris could get up on top of and like run around and jump off and all that. And on the way back, at that time I was working stage left. I wound up with this guitar, and I just baseball bat swung it right into the cage and like just left it and walked off. And I remember Susan was looking at me, the manager at the time, like, oh my God, oh my God. I'm like, fuck that guy, right? I don't give a shit, you know? So I probably said like, I don't care if he's your fucking husband. So I was pissed, right? So I'm like, what do I do? I got no guitars now. We're gonna go support GNR tomorrow. How do I pull this freaking rabbit out of my ass, right? So whatever. So I remember that night, load out, and I go see Chris in the back lounge, and he's like, man, I'm so sorry. Do you want my per diem? I think I got like $276. And I'm like, no, I want a fucking guitar. So what we did was, at that time, Peavey was giving us gear, because believe it or not, nobody else would. I know later, like Mesa Boogie gave him gear, and like Matt had gotten a DW drum kit on his own, because Matt always played Yamaha, right? And at the time, before this tour, I was working for Nick Menza with Megadeth, and he was a Yamaha endorsee. And I remember talking to the main guy in Japan, Hagi, right? Hagi-san was the main guy in Japan for like artist relations with Yamaha, right? And I remember talking to him and like begging him and anybody I could talk to him, like, please give this guy a kit. Like, this guy is, besides being a phenomenal drummer, this band is going to explode. And nobody would, right? So Matt got a kit on his own, but when we came to like backline, nobody would give us anything, right? So Peavey worked with us, right? There was a guy at American Music in Seattle, this guy Billy, sorry I can't remember your last name, but he and I put this stuff together with Peavey. He was a huge help. So if it wasn't the day we went and did like the Peavey factory tour, it was close. But at any rate, I called them up, and they found a guy in a music store that brought me down like Peavey's version of a Les Paul, you know, solid body, double humbuckers, right? And I think I used it as a spare. I think I had one Les Paul left, right? Because we had this kind of like Merlot red wine red Les Paul. I think it was a 73 custom that Chris loved, and that one was kind of sacred, like he wouldn't break it. So I had that, but I had nothing else, right? And like we're doing like Rusty Cage. Rusty Cage, you have to drop the E string to a B, right? And then try to get it in tune. And like, usually you have a guitar set aside for that kind of tuning, because you put like a heavier string on the E, right? You go from whatever he was playing then 46s, you go up to like a bass string, like to like a 65, just because it won't stay in tune. So I'm like having to do all these crazy, like, you know, tunings on guitars that with the way the songs are, you can't intonate it, right? Because you have to, once you change the tuning on a string like that on a guitar, in order for it to, you have to intonate it. So I should have really a guitar for B, a guitar for D songs, drop D, which is where the E string, the low E gets dropped to a D, and then a standard. So at least 3 guitars in those tunings and then another 3 spares. So 6 guitars minimum. I had 2. I had a main guitar and then a spare, right? So there was that. And then I remember when we went to do the Peavey factory tour, I don't know if those guys were into it as much as I was, but we go into this anechoic chamber, right? And at the time, they're developing the 5150 amp for Eddy VanHalen, right? Because they had like just signed him, right? So they're doing the guitar, I think it was called the Wolfgang. And then the 5150 was his amp line with Peavey. And they've got one of his old Marshall cabinets in this anechoic chamber. And they're like playing it and listening to it, right? And they were having trouble with getting it, what they were making, to sound like his, right? And if I'm violating some copyright infringement, oh the hell well, it's 30 friggin' years later. And what it was is, they found out they had to put like a laser on it, right? Or a strobe, they put a strobe on it. And that cabinet didn't have an original back on it, right? So it being that it's a closed back cabinet, when you play it, when the speakers come back, they create an actual pressure wave, right? Just out of physical movement. And because it didn't have an original back, it had a much thinner back, it allowed it to flex. So that's what they were missing, because they would put like a standard like back on their cabinets and it wasn't flexing. So that was the problem. So they figured it out, and then they started making like their cabinets with like a thinner back or whatever, and there you go. Then they got the sound they wanted to. So sorry to let the, you know, man behind the curtain out, but I just happened to be there and heard the story, and I thought it was fascinating. I was like, man, hats off to you guys. You really did your homework. And I know I'm getting off topic, but I just thought that was kind of a cool story there. Yeah. So at any rate, we get through that. We go home for Christmas. Unfortunately, I find out at Thanksgiving, my dad's got cancer. He gets diagnosed. What year is it? This is 92, right? So day after, have Thanksgiving dinner with my parents. Day after Thanksgiving, he goes in on Friday.
Okay, back up.
Yeah.
So what tour is this?
This is Badmotorfinger with Soundgarden. This is 1990. This is, yeah, Badmotorfinger, not Loud Love. Louder Than Love was before that, right? So sorry. So that was 90. So this is 91. He goes in on Black Friday, finds out he's got cancer. So I go back to work. He's right in, he's doing chemo and all that. Come home at Christmas, see him, he's better. And then unfortunately, he starts to deteriorate. So we go back out, and I think we finished up February 1st at a gig called Compton Terrace outside in Phoenix, Arizona, right? And I'm like, I gotta go. My old man's dying, right? I gotta go home, right? And they're like, and I remember it was Matt and Kim who like were with me when I left to get in the van to like go to the hotel. I think they were leaving the Guns. They were either continuing on Guns, or they might have been leaving Guns to go support Skid Row or something. I don't know. I can't remember. It's so long ago. But I remember those guys were out there, and I mean, they're like, man, we're sorry, and you know, whatever. And I was like, okay. And they're like, okay, we'll go home, take care of it, and you know, we'll see you later, right? So I went home. My dad died the 2nd of March of '92. So I was home with him about a month, or a little over a month. And then, you know, get through the funeral and all that, get through March. It's like getting around April 1st, and I like call management back up, like, okay, like, you know, I'd like to come back to work, whatever. And then I get like told, like, yeah, we don't want you to come back. You know, so I lost my dad, I lost my gig. At the time, it was, you know, it was a kick to the sack. Now, whatever. It happens, right? It's just, that's life, right? Somebody else comes in, the production manager changed, you know, Chris may have not liked me. I don't know. He may have fucking hated me. I don't know. Didn't really talk to him that much, right? But whatever, what's done is done. So now I'm sitting home. My wife, now, we weren't married then, so we had like connected in the summer. We'd known each other years before, but we'd kind of like reconnected in the summer of '91 when I was home, and we were seeing each other, and you know, next thing you know, it's like, we're gonna have a kid, right? All right, cool. So we worked through that, right? And like, well, I guess we should get married. So we got married, and it was, the GNR came through with Faith No More, and I forget who else, and played the stadium in Buffalo, right? And so I went up and saw him, Rich Stadium. I want to say it was in July or whatever, and you know, kind of saw everybody again and all that. And I gotta give props to Mike Borden, Puffy, the drummer that was in Faith. He was the one guy that came up to me and said, "Man, I'm really sorry to hear about your dad. Like, really sorry." So hats off to you, you know. But whatever, seeing the people I know from GNR and Faith guys, and great to see the show. So one of the guys that worked for Guns N' Roses, and I'm going to say his name because everybody already knows it, his name's Tom Mayhew, all right? Well, I met him working on Megadeth in 1990, all right, and 91. And originally we were like oil and water, and then we ended up like having a little, you know, spat, if you will, and then we were really good friends. And another guy that like helped my career immeasurably, right? Because he's the guy that when they were looking for a guitar tech on Guns, when they were starting up after the riots in Montreal and the Guns Metallica thing, he's like, hey, call this guy, right? Because I wasn't the first choice, but Tom was like, no, call this guy, he's the guy, whatever. So that's how I got the gig, because of Tom. So I will always be grateful. So August, whatever, I go out, no rehearsals, right to the gig. Thankfully, the guitar tech at the time, Elwood, who now is the bass player in ZZ Top, was really cool and like walked me through it as best he could, because there was really no set list, right? Like when they would be walking up the ramp, when Axl would walk up the ramp and with the band, somebody would run in front of them and either be going, Jungle, Night Train, you know, whatever song we're starting with, and you go from that. And then it's just like, you know, well, okay, they'll call out whatever's going to be the next song. So you got to be ready with like every guitar, right? And you know, I made it work. You know, I did.
So you're teching for who at this point?
Gentleman's name was Gilby Clarke, because Izzy Stradlin, midway through he was like, I had enough. I'm going home, right? So then they brought Gilby into play, right? Wonderful human being. We can talk more about him later. And Elwood was already there taking care of Izzy, and then he'd had enough, and he's like, I want out. And then that's when Tom put my name up, and, you know, I didn't kind of force the issue.
So did you ever work with Peavey before?
I hadn't, no.
Okay.
No. So I came in and, you know, thankfully it worked out. So now I'm, you know, working with Guns N' Roses, right? And we're out doing the Guns Metallica tour, right? And so I was like, kind of like, fuck, this is pretty big, right? I may have achieved, like I said, my goal was to work for the biggest band in the world at the time. Well, at that time, I don't know if there are any tours out there that were bigger. I mean, I guess you could say if the Stones were out, maybe they were, or U2 at the time, maybe Michael Jackson, he was still touring. So, I mean, there was other stuff out there, but I don't know. And, you know, for me, it was like, yeah, this is pretty fucking big. But yeah, I mean, I just tried to keep my head down and my nose clean and make sure shit was in tune and shit always worked, and, you know, did the best I could. But there was some crazy shit on that, you know.